We're going to now start with our special sponsored presentation. The Cinema Advertising Council is bringing a special sponsored presentation where we're going to feature Doug Pulick, who's going to come up. He's head of research at National Cinemedia. So as you all wind your way in, why don't you wind your hands together for Doug? Come on up, Doug.
Everybody, is the mic on? Excellent. All right, very good. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Doug Pulick from National Cinemedia, head of research, but also a member of the CAC, the Cinema Advertising Council, which is obviously an advocacy group for cinema advertising. I wanted to give you just a little bit of some quick history before we get into Dr. Craig Stacey's presentation that is obviously being featured here today. And that is that the CAC, members of the CAC went to an international conference for cinema advertising, I guess probably about a year and a half ago in Las Vegas. And there we were exposed to some market mix modeling by a British company named Brand Science. And something that we had not seen before was that one of the elements introduced, one of the media, was actually cinema. And what they were able to prove to us conclusively that cinema did indeed, in fact, have an impact in terms of ROI. They were actually able to show in several different instances how cinema was able to help move the needle in terms of European advertisers and with various schedules that they had abroad. So obviously, this certainly set off bells in our heads, and we said we definitely have to try to pursue this. So what we did was we pretty much cast a very wide net, and we took a look at some folks, and Dr. Craig Stacey, who is actually a research director at one of the media research centers at NYU's Stern Business School, has his own company called MPG, and he does market mix modeling. And I think he was intrigued by the challenge that we gave him to try to quantify cinema's impact. And we were intrigued by something that he does, and I don't want to take away too much of, steal his thunder, but he does something with his modeling called time series modeling. And what's unique about that is that many of the models that are out there, and there are so many different methodologies, they don't always look at long term. They tend to look at short term in terms of advertise today, what's the effect tomorrow. He looks very much down the road in terms of what is the long term impact of that. And I think what's also interesting about releasing this study, sharing this today with you at this particular time, is the fact that it's coming on the heels of a release from the CRE, the Council for Research Excellence, from a white paper that they had released called The Status of Market Mix Modeling, that was written actually by Sequent Partners. In fact, Jim Spaeth is here, and if you haven't seen him, talk to him about it. He certainly give you chapter and verse. But the point is that it gave a rundown of the status of the marketplace for market mix modeling, and more importantly, the fact that it is wanting, that it needs to be overhauled because so many of the models that were written were done some 20 some odd years ago. And as a result, it does not reflect the kind of media landscape that is complex and that is out there right now. And it certainly does not reflect the kind of media that's reflected in this room here in terms of the digital place-based media. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Craig Stacey.
Thanks, Doug. Just quick show of hands. Anyone in here not familiar with this whole notion of marketing mix modeling? Good. Most of you have heard of this beforehand. For those of you who did raise your hand, don't feel bad. I was trained in this as an academic and didn't even know this industry existed around marketing mix modeling until sometime in the 1990s when I left academia and went into industry. But this stuff has been around since the 1960s. Believe it or not, it's one of those things that got to start in academia before it moved over into industry, and moved into industry in the late 80s, early 90s in particular, because of the advent of scanner sales data from folks like IRI and Nielsen. So all of a sudden you had performance data and you had all of this advertising data and other promotional types of data, and how do I look to measure the return on investment for all of these things that I'm doing with my marketing mix. So that's where this whole notion of marketing mix modeling came from. As I said, it's been around in industry since the late 80s, early 90s, got started at places like Kraft and General Foods and the Coca-Cola Company where I used to work. And what Jim and Alice said in their paper, which I recommend you all take a look at, is that folks are still using models from the 1990s. What's even worse is that the marketing science behind those models is from the 1960s. And so the stuff that I was trained on, the stuff that I initially did my marketing mix modeling with, is based on marketing science from the 1960s. And I was born in the 60s, so I've been able to experience all of the changes that have occurred since then. And the 21st century media and marketing landscape is nothing like it was in the 1960s. I remember listening to college football games on the radio, and we only had 3 networks, and I lived in a town that had a local PBS station. When I was in college, my dad finally broke down and got cable TV, and then later on we've got all of these touch points that we're exposed to, as it says, video everywhere. I better grab the clicker pretty quickly. So I want to talk to you about a study which we've recently completed. We're going to be writing a white paper on this for on behalf of the Cinema Advertising Council. This is a marketing mix modeling study that was conducted for a national cereal brand, not to be mentioned at this point in time. For those of you not familiar with academic research, we tend to do blinded studies because otherwise you've got to get permission from the advertiser and all sorts of people to be able to present results. And in this study, while we were looking at the impact of everything else that we could measure, we were primarily interested in isolating the effectiveness of cinema advertising on brand sales. And as I mentioned beforehand, it was for a major cereal brand. Just scope of the cereal, we were looking at data from 2012 through May of 2013, working with sales data from IRI InfoScan. We were able to get our media spending data from Kantar. We got the cinema advertising data directly from the vendors of that data. And in this study, what I'm going to be presenting to you today is focused on the major grocery accounts across the U.S. And the results we're going to be looking at are, what on average happens at a typical grocery account within the U.S. over this time period. By the way, we're going to have time for a few questions at the very end. So if you've got any questions, hold off and we'll cover those at the end. You guys all remember y equals mx plus b, so your dependent variable on the left-hand side of the equation. We were looking at equivalized volume. Since cereal comes in different size boxes, IRI and Nielsen equivalize everything to the 16-ounce box. I can tell you this particular brand was typically sold in 10 and 11-ounce boxes, depending on the amount of ingredient that was in it. We were looking at both cinema impressions and dollars. Since it was Kantar media data, we were looking at TV dollars. And then from the IRI data, we had all of the price and in-store promotional data so that we were able to control for all of those things that are happening at retail. Just to give you an idea of what the volume sales looked like over this time period, you do see some spikes in there. The brand grew, it gained distribution very, very rapidly. It was not introduced until 2012 in the United States, but coming from a major manufacturer, they gained distribution and sales very, very quickly. The average price per unit, because I can tell you, having worked in the CPG world since the late 1980s, things like price and in-store promotion are the primary drivers of these things. And so it's, take control of those and then try to tease out things like TV and cinema and all of the other media channels that we want to look at. You can see total TV spend on the top graph here. There was certainly a lot of TV spending for the launch, and then they maintained TV on and off throughout the model time frame. With respect to cinema, there were 2 campaigns. One was much larger than the second. These were separated by 4 weeks' time, and we actually modeled these 2 campaigns separately so we could look at the results there. Just so you can see what the cinema impressions look like related back to the cinema dollars, which we just showed you. We used an average CPM for cinema of $27. We wanted to model things with dollars since that's what we had from Kantar Media for TV. So the cinema impressions behind the cinema dollars, which you just saw, equated to 59.2 million over the entire time frame. But as you can see, the vast majority of that came from the July campaign for this particular brand. And this goes back to what Doug was talking about with respect to time series modeling. And for those of you who knew Simon Broadbent or you're familiar with the work that Simon Broadbent did, he was a brilliant man. He's probably going to roll over in his grave when I say the things that I'm about to say. But I've never believed in ad stocks. They don't make sense from a conceptual perspective because it's not impressions, it's not GRPs that carry over. It's the actual behavior that carries over into time. And unfortunately, most folks out there are working with these things called ad stocks, where when they're looking at TV or print or cinema or paid search advertising, online display, any kind of media, they're working with different decay rates to try to fit what they like best with respect to results to see how advertising carries over into time. We all believe that advertising has carryover effects. I wrote my dissertation looking at carryover effects of advertising. And it can either be that you see an ad today and you don't buy something until the next week or the next week. That's called a delayed response effect. Or it can be that a TV advertisement brings you into a brand, you buy it this week, and as a result of buying it this week, you should get some credit, give some credit to TV for future purchases of that. So those are the two types of carryover effects that we look at. When I first moved over from academia, went to work at IRI where I was managing analytic product management and development, I was like, wow, you guys are totally ignoring all of this work that's been done with respect to the carryover effects of advertising. Everybody was focusing on how differently one store responded to another or one DMA responds versus another, which cross-sectional effects are extremely important, but the way people were trying to manage carryover effects was through these artificial things called ad stocks. Well, we're working with actual time series models where the data tells you what the response is week on week versus whether or not there's any sort of effect in following weeks. So you can see here with respect to this particular brand, we've got cinema advertising on the top, we've got TV advertising on the bottom. Not by design, but they coincidentally have a very similar response in the immediate week. That thing on the y-axis is an elasticity. For those of you who don't remember econ, here we're talking about what kind of sales response you get related to a 1% change in cinema advertising on the top graph, a 1% change in TV advertising on the bottom graph. We've done another study for the CAC, which we're not reporting today just because of the time limitations, but it was very interesting to see how that we saw very similar elasticities for cinema advertising for two very different packaged goods brands. So we see comparable elasticities for cinema versus TV, slightly higher effects in following weeks for TV than we do for cinema, but in all honesty, they're just very small differences that we saw there. Where the real news comes into play, is in a slide after this. For those of you who know marketing mix models, you know the dreaded pie chart. One of my business partners was one of the founders of MMA, and I blame him for introducing pie charts to folks because what people do here is they're trying to decompose the total volume of a brand sales into the different drivers. In this one, we've got base and trade lumped in together, but typically 50, 60, 70, as much as 85% of your volume may be base, which is unexplained. People say that's the long-term effects, that's the goodwill of advertising. As a CMO, you really would like to know what's driving base, whereas these models don't tell you much of anything about base, but that's a different conversation. You can see here, though, that TV accounted for a much larger slice of the pie, as opposed to cinema. So 7% of the volume coming from television versus 0.5% of the volume coming from, 7% for TV as opposed to 0.5% from cinema. We're going to stop there because a lot of folks are tempted to then calculate ROIs based on these things, which are looking backwards in the mirror, and I suggest that you not do that because you can get very misleading results. I don't know if any of you know Jan Fogoni from ComScore. He was at IRI when I was there. He once quantified the effects of marketing mix models at misleading manufacturers in the 1980s from taking money out of consumer promotion and moving it into trade promotion. And I was at the Coca-Cola company after a lot of this had been done, where people said, wow, we're getting these huge effects from in-store displays and TPRs, and let's keep doing more of that and cut back on TV. I was there a decade later and saw how much damage they had done to the brands in terms of cutting back on consumer promotion because they were looking at results like this. So to show you the kinds of results that I think people should be looking at with respect to marketing mix models, one thing that you definitely want to do with respect to effectiveness is to look at that slice of the pie, the volume that you're getting from TV versus cinema, on a per dollar or a per impression, whatever metric you can do to compare these against each other. And as you'll see, because you saw earlier how many more dollars were spent on TV as opposed to cinema, we're seeing on average that every ad dollar spent in cinema results in 1.37 times the incremental volume that you get from a TV dollar. So that's one very encouraging point, that cinema advertising works when compared to television advertising. And I don't think there are many people out there who are going to doubt that TV advertising works. Something else is extremely important to look at. I told you beforehand, don't be tempted to take that slice of the pie and divide it by the total spend or the total impressions to look at something in the backward mirror, because what a CMO, what a brand manager, what a media planner should be more concerned with is, what am I going to get from the next impression or the next dollar? Once again, I'm not going to bore you with economics, but I don't know how many of you remember that things are at an optimum when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so that's what we're doing with the results here, is we're looking at the marginal sales revenues. Since we weren't working directly with the client, we didn't know what the average gross margin was for the retailer, for the manufacturer, so we're not looking at marginal profit here, which is what we recommend doing, but we're looking at marginal sales revenue. And this is where the real proof of the pudding is that cinema advertising works for this brand, is that for for the next dollar spent on cinema advertising, that would provide 18 times the marginal sales revenue impact as opposed to TV. So you definitely, if you're thinking about how to reallocate going forward, if you're going to take money someplace, you should be taking it from television and putting it into cinema based on these results for this particular brand. Just in conclusion, and we'll have a couple of minutes for questions after that, for the two brands we've studied for the Cinema Advertising Council, we've seen that cinema is a viable medium for generating sales. In both of the studies, we've seen that it can be as effective, even more effective, in driving significant sales volume per dollar spent, as we saw here, 1.37 times that for cinema when compared to television. The last two points I want to make is that as a result of the way that a lot of people are measuring the carryover effects, the time series effects of advertising, other types of consumer promotion and trade promotion, you're sometimes giving credit where credit shouldn't be due and not giving enough credit to things where it should be due. We see this a lot with digital media, in particular, the way that people are modeling still today. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just in terms of the way that we should be interpreting results from marketing mix models. The way we've done it historically can be misleading in terms of how we make resource allocations, and I would encourage people to start thinking about things on the margin as opposed to looking backwards in the mirror and looking at averages over the time period where you've just spent the money. So AJ said we could turn it over to questions if anybody had them, and there's supposed to be someone around with a mic. And there she is. Doug better not have a question for me. I hope he has a comment.
Excellent job. I did have a question, maybe just for the benefit of hopefully myself as well as some of the folks here. Could you just explain a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how IRI InfoScan data works, the collection of it, and how that's put together?
Sure. So both IRI and Nielsen collect all of the POS data from retailers, and then they create these syndicated services. The service from IRI is called InfoScan. The one from Nielsen is ScanTrack. Having worked for IRI and having been a client of Nielsen, I know the two of them very well, they're really good at reporting that kind of data. As far as the in-store causal data, whether or not something was on a special display or there was a feature ad, they've got folks who audit a sample of the stores, and that's how they come up with their syndicated data around what sales were, what the price was, what the levels of promotional activity were.
Opportunities.
Was that you?
Hello. Yeah, Tony Jarvis, Olympic Media Consultancy.
I've met you before.
Yes.
Many years ago.
And I was also very proud to meet Simon Broadbent and Erwin Efron, who would indeed, I think, be turning in their graves. But first, let me congratulate...
Tony's British, so that's why he's taking this Simon Dratfield approach.
Well, Erwin was a true American and brilliant, so rest in peace. So first of all, a huge thank you, I think, to CAC for pushing the envelope in an area that we all need in the advertising business. But I would suggest if Erwin and Simon were here, and I know Jim Spaeth is here, and if I remember his article, I think they would suggest you missed a couple of very important things. First of all, you've compared impressions in cinema to dollars. And my recollection is dollars are a very, very poor surrogate for estimating pressure of advertising, and which is why some of us in the industry have been pushing for the measurement of ad exposure, whatever the channel is. And the ideal input for a model like this, I think they would suggest, would be ad exposure, although I appreciate we don't have it in many media. If I remember Jim's original paper, the econometric people suggested that while sales is sort of wonderful, we should be looking at discounted cash flow. So I'll just leave it to you to comment on what ad pressure metric we should be really putting in this model in an ideal situation, and should we be going beyond sales to discounted cash flow, which addresses your time series perspective.
Definitely, Tony, thanks. Number one, we modeled dollars versus dollars because from Kantar Media, as you all probably know, that's all that we had access to. We didn't have impressions, ratings for TV, especially not at the level at which we needed them to assign them down to key accounts within DMAs. So we did the best we could by putting things on equal metrics. I'm glad you mentioned that because I do believe that things should be compared based on the same metric. Whenever possible, we tend to work with impressions as opposed to even GRPs. Because we now have access for a lot of digital media to impressions and being able to look at everything on an impressions basis. Here we were stuck with dollars spent because that's all that we had, and I realize that's a limitation of the study. We do a lot of work with customer lifetime value types of projects where I do believe with you with respect to discounting cash flow. And with the marginal profitability analysis, that's absolutely what we do is when we're looking at marginal revenue and marginal sales, we've got to work with a client to figure out what kind of discount rate they want us to use to be able to discount that cash flow over the future. So I think that's just another one of the areas where marketing mix models need to be improved, and there are some companies out there that are pushing the envelope.
Thank you again for this. I agree with Tony in regards that this is the direction we need to go. What advice would you give to media owners, the operators of digital place-based, in following suit in what you'll be able to accomplish? How should we be working with media mix modeling going forward? And also thinking about some of the size of the operators that we have and the audiences that they get versus the MMM model, which is usually a bigger, more audience model.
Right. So it's not just cinema that's suffering from this. It's amazing the conversations that we've had both before this project and since this project, working with one of the biggest providers of shopper marketing within stores, where they're convinced that their vehicles aren't being represented accurately. And we've done studies across 16 brands for them, where we've demonstrated that current mix models aren't properly quantifying the effects of in-store shopper marketing events because they're not looking at carryover effects. In some cases, they have refused to give the data to the brands to be included in marketing mix models because they believe that they're not being evaluated properly, and they recommend that people use controlled store tests or get their marketing mix model vendor to be looking at things the right way. So I know I answered your first question. I can't remember what your second one was. For better or worse, and I'm a huge proponent of marketing mix modeling, I just don't agree with the way that a lot of people are continuing to practice it. What worked in the 1990s when I was at IRI and Coca-Cola doesn't work anymore. When you've got paid, owned, and earned media all being interdependent on each other and one thing driving the other, you can't place things in a single equation model as people continue to do. So it requires advanced econometric modeling. I think there are some vendors out there who are trying to catch up, but unfortunately a lot of people are taking what worked for CPG companies where this was first introduced in the 1990s and trying to force digital media and cinema media to work the same way that TV and print. And TV and print don't even work the same way anymore. I'm sitting at home, I'm watching a football game on TV with my laptop in my lap and my smartphone off to the side, and maybe I've got my iPad over here. I see a TV ad which sends me either to the company's website, or maybe I Facebook or tweet or do something. It's a new world that we're living in, and you've either got to evaluate things differently or come up with a different methodology. So as I said, this particular company that does shopper marketing, in many cases, they just ask not to be included in the marketing mix model because they know that they're not going to change the minds of the big guys, Nielsen and IRI in particular, to start modeling things differently. And so they have, in most of their studies, they do some sort of a match panel or control store test to be able to show people what kind of results they think are actually coming from the program. You need sunglasses up here.
Any more questions at all? Yeah, we got over here. Well,
Thank you. When you made reference to the marginal revenue, and we're taking a look at for every next dollar in television, you should take that dollar and put it into cinema. I was thinking of it from a media perspective. Would you sort of liken that to the whole idea of once you've saturated a particular medium, that all you're getting now is frequency, and you're not getting any reach? So I'm just trying to think of how to position something like that so that maybe it's a little more understandable to folks in the media world as opposed to the modeling world.
Yeah, it's where you are on the curve. So if you think of what a response curve looks like, I mean, we're certainly not thinking that media has increasing returns, so there are diminishing returns. And in this particular case, we just saw that cinema was way down on the curve with a lot of room for growth with respect to producing marginal sales revenue. Whereas TV, I'm not going to say they were oversaturating, maybe they were exactly where they should be. We didn't have the rest of the data to do the marginal profitability analysis, but certainly overspending on television relative to cinema in this particular case. And we see that in many studies, whether it's we're looking at other types of digital media that people are working with, or that they should be taking money and investing it in other places.
great. Well, thank you very much, Craig, and appreciate it. Let's give a hand to Craig.